you very sincerely for this possibility on the name of Proyecto Bicentenario of Universidad de Chile and Senda, Centro de Estudios Nacionales de Desarrollo Alternativo, and the director of Proyecto Bicentenario, Mr. Pablo Oyarzún, and the director of Senda, Professor Hugo Facio. So, in behalf of them, we thank you very sincerely for your disposition to come to our country and also to have this conversation. Thank you very much, Ezra.
It's my pleasure, Manuel. I'm only sorry that we are doing it this way instead of my being in Chile, but it will happen.
Oh yes, we are sure it will.
Thank you.
Well, we got acquainted with your work, mainly your book of 2004, Dismantling Democratic States, and we read it, and immediately we understood that what you were telling on this work was hugely important for our country. Because if there is one example in the world of an extreme experiment in dismantling of democratic states, that is precisely Chile. I would like to give you just one figure so that you will understand how far this has come. The employment in the state has fallen from circa 20% in 1970 to around 7% today. But the additional problem is that fully half of the civil service is not civil service in reality according to their contracts, because they have contracts on a yearly basis. So every year in December, half of the civil service does not know if their contracts will be renewed in the following year. Even high posts in the civil service are in this kind of contracts. For example, there is one unity that was created to manage all the private concessions of roads, which manages millions and millions, billions of dollars, really, a year. Well, this unit is composed from the head to the last person of civil servants that are all on a per contract basis. So each year their contracts are renewed. That is the state of how this experiment has affected our state. And then more recently, the problem in public universities has arisen, and as you well know, thousands of students have been marching through the streets during last year to reclaim the rebuilding of the public university and public tertiary education system. And then, studying the problem, we found that the idea of privatizing the public universities had the same consequences regarding the academics. Because the academics in Chile, they were mainly public servants until a couple of decades ago, or 3 decades. But then the public financing of universities, the direct financing for the institutions, fell terribly. For example, in 1990, 2 decades ago, in the main university, University of Chile, the public funding was about 70% of the total budget of the institution, about 70%. And today, it is less than 10%. In parallel, the student fees have risen accordingly, and the selling of services by the university has also risen a lot. But and most of the students' fees now, after the mobilizations, are financed by the state. So the state, in fact, gives the money indirectly through the students. But of course, the students get a liability over those fundings, because they have to repay them when they will be professionals, let's say. Well, but the direct funding has decreased from about 70% to 10%. And what has been the consequence? The consequence is that the labor relations of the academics has gotten precarious, terribly precarious.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Manuel? The last thing, I didn't hear it well.
Sure.
The last phrase.
The labor relations, the kind of contract the academics has been is now very precarious. Let's say is unstable, because most of the academics are now contracted on a per year basis or a per course basis. So they contracted to give one course, for example, or they have a contract for 1 year, and then the next year we will see. Perhaps they will get another contract, or perhaps not. Of course,
do they Manuel? Excuse me to interrupt you. Just to ask you a question. Do they have a trade union that represents them or not?
Yes, they do. But yes. And the public employees also have. But they have been unable to resist this, because all this was really imposed during the dictatorship. But the democratic governments have played allegiance to the new public management ideas of the third wave.
Right.
And so they continued with these policies. So now we have a very, very precarious, very unstable kind of labor relation, both for the public service and for the academics. And all this has been enhanced as well because of the privatization of the pension system. Because part of the traditional, let's say, social contract of the state with its employees was that they would get a pension for life. Well, today, for example, a judge has a pension from the private system that is about 10% of its current wage. So, in fact, they do not have pensions. Imagine, judges. So, in the academics, the same. So, that's the problem we have. And of course, your writings have been quite an inspiration to really try to convince the authorities and try to convince the country as a whole that we need to have a professional civil service, and that we need to have an institution that gives academics, on the other hand, a stable condition so that they can work in peace, let's say. That's the
okay. I don't know if this consoles you, Manuel, but what you describe is actually something that has been fairly generalized. For example, when you talk about the outsourcing, I mean, it's been going on for a number of years, of course, this NPM and so on. If you take a country like even New Zealand, or you take a country like Great Britain, they have gone very, very far in terms of the diplomatic corps of the United Kingdom outsources the giving of visas, for example, all over the world. So they have had a tendency to just, basically empty the state, if I can put it that way, and so on. And they keep going further and further in this direction. As you know, from my point of view, I think it is the most unfortunate thing that has been happening. And some countries have pushed it much further than others. And there seems to be no stopping them where that's concerned, I think. So that, in a way, I think, and of course Chile, which I've looked into a bit, has also gone extremely far. Now, you know what I think, and I'm not going to be repetitive, about this sort of getting rid, basically, of the state, or what I called some years ago the dismantling of the state. The state, for some reason, has come to have a very bad reputation, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
Politicians dump on it all the time. And not always to their own advantage, which is what makes it a bit of a, how should I say, a bit of a puzzle for me. Why does a politician undermine the state and undermine the bureaucracy, which consists of the very people who are going to put into apply the programs that he's voting for? It kind of doesn't make any sense in a way. Okay, maybe there are some votes to be gained from attacking the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is associated with all kinds of things and so on and so forth. But the bureaucracy is actually not making the laws, and is not making the regulations most of the time. All expenditures are always voted by a parliament. Then the bureaucracy is given. So it's not by attacking the bureaucracy that you're really going to be saving a lot of money. It's by attacking certain programs that the party in power, whichever party it is, votes. And these politicians are voting all these expenditures, and therefore these expenditures require a structure which to dispense with the money, to allocate the funds, and so on and so forth. So there's something always very nebulous, if I can put it that way, about this whole process, which in some ways for politicians is self-defeating, or for those who run the state is self-defeating and so on. Are they merely seeking temporary, easy, cheap ways of making a name for themselves and so on? I think there is a lot of that. But there is also the ideology, which we have talked about, which is a state to prosper must have a minimal state structure, you see. And that has made the rounds now for the last 30 or maybe even longer, 30 or 40 years, and so on. So you see right now, for example, in the United States, during the campaign, the presidential campaign, a kind of a discussion that takes place of what is the philosophy of the state, what should be the role of the state. I mean, we're actually back to debating this now. Whether the state, in fact, has obligations to society, or whether we are back to a kind of individualistic kind of society, which is what the Republican Party says. Basically, they say that wealth is created by entrepreneurship. Therefore, it is created by individuals. So if it's created for individuals, the collectivity is not so important anymore, you see, because really they point their finger at individuals and so on. And I think the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party is a complete believer in this. And he talks always about individuals. It's this Ayn Rand philosophy that has been adopted. So in a way, we are going quite far backwards in some respects. And I find it a very, very unfortunate development. Because after all, if you say all we need to do is reduce taxes, that's a recipe for the state not doing very much, because where is the state going to get its revenue from? So I think that what your experiencing and what you have been experiencing in Chile is quite widespread across the world. much less so in European countries, though now the crisis, who knows what that will lead to with the immense austerity measures and so on, because you can always justify by an economic necessity rather than some philosophical ideology, which is the case in the United States, for example. Now, I want to come back to something that you mentioned, which is the universities and how this impacts on the universities. Now, there was a time in the United States when the major public universities, the University of California, the University of Michigan, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Minnesota, great public institutions. Those institutions also received 70, 80, even more % of their funding from the state. So it was always a negotiation between the universities, the state universities, and the state. But by the state, I don't mean the federal government. I mean the state of California, the state of Michigan, and so on and so forth. Over the years, they found that politicians are very unreliable and that they could not leave themselves open to this kind of never knowing what's going to happen. And the politicians putting a squeeze on the institutions to make all sorts of cuts and so on and so forth, which meant that the university could not compete anymore and become, like Stanford. Berkeley's next to Stanford, but they had completely different forms of funding. And you know how politicians don't really understand how universities work. They don't understand how research is conducted. And I've always been struck by that, actually. A complete and utter ignorance. They think, for example, that academics just go and they teach 2 hours a week and then they go home and they sit drinking beer. So, they have no understanding of what it is, the search for knowledge, encouraging young scholars, informing students, meeting with students, preparing courses, and so on and so forth. All those things which all academics, all researchers do. And you constantly had this misunderstanding, and therefore they felt fully justified in asking for the reduction of their budgets. And this, again, is something that went on for many times. So what did the American universities do? They decided that over the years, if they are to remain great universities, the big ones I'm talking about, and then they had to get out of this trap of being in the hands of politicians. They couldn't rely on them because the state might have financial difficulties. The first thing it would cut would be the universities. They found no sympathy or understanding on the part of the politicians. And so they undertook means themselves to keep the tuition as low as possible, although it has risen. They had to find ways to find revenue. So there was fundraising that they got into so that they could compete for good students, so that they could compete for the professors with Stanford, with Harvard, with Princeton, with Yale, etc., etc. And actually they succeeded. And they have also inversed, but it was something that the universities chose to do in the United States. For example, a place like Berkeley used to receive 80% more of its budget from the state. It now receives approximately 20%. And the same is true of almost all the other major public universities. But this was a policy to safeguard their competitive position and also to get out of this trap of depending on unreliable people, basically, you see. And it actually worked quite well, except now with all the difficulties of states, municipalities, and so on and so forth, there really isn't much more they can do. In other words, there isn't funds. The state always is important. In other words, the state, in one way or another, if you get a loan to go to the state university, the state backed the loan, for example. So without that, or there were all kinds of work-study programs. who paid for that? The university paid for it, but it got the money from the state. So in some ways, the most private universities, the richest universities, in some ways also depend on the state, you see, because there are so many indirect ways of financing. For example, if you apply for a National Science Foundation grant, in sciences, the money is very, very substantial. It can be even several $100 million for NASA research, Defense Department, and so on and so forth. The university can take up to 100%. So if you apply for $1 million, you apply for $2 million. The million becomes a million because the other one goes to overhead to the university. And that goes into the budget, which allows other research to be funded. So really, in some ways, even the richest universities depend on the state. They cannot totally, but they have more leeway than would a university that's not so wealthy, and so on. So I think that I'm sure that in a place like Chile, where fundraising, as it is in many countries in Europe, by the way, they have always depended on the state. And therefore, for the state to pull out, obviously, is catastrophic. And so, while America has a different kind of tradition, and there are lots of people who went to these state places and are willing to fund them in some ways, I suspect that in Chile, as in Europe, the funds are not available outside the state. So when the state pulls out, you have a big gaping hole. And therefore, I can perfectly understand and sympathize with the situation that you described, and that, there doesn't seem to be a solution to it beyond the state. So when the state pulls out. Now, let me come to the third point that you raised, which is the idea that the academic profession is under very severe attack, because when you don't know if you have a contract at the end of the year, it becomes not a very attractive profession. And again, many I've noticed it here, American universities have gone from, instead of giving contracts as they used to do in the past, there is a whole class that has developed of itinerant workers. In other words, they are so dispensable and they lead such difficult lives because they get a one-year contract. Maybe at the end of the year, maybe it will be, we'll reappoint you, you'll have a second year here. And so it's like you're a traveling salesman with your suitcase and going from one state to another, one university to another, having to teach 15, 20, even more sometimes, hours a week for very little.
We call them taxi professors.
Exactly, taxi. And now we have if you look at the number, it has grown and grown and grown. As the state cuts its budget, that's what happens. So this means that academic freedom is jeopardized. Because you have become so dependent. It means you become like a traveling salesman or a taxi academic. It means that you are not going to attract anymore the best people, because who would want to subject themselves to this? It's better to go and get a job in a store than to do this thing and have some, and to move every year from one place to the other. You don't know if next semester they will need you, and you become very dispensable as an academic. And the whole idea of academic stability, the whole idea of academic stability is political. Just like a civil servant, you are protected to express, because you want to express some, of course, maybe uncomfortable ideas, but you should have full protection for that. And you need a certain stability in order to carry out your job. You cannot be waiting at the end of the year whether you have a job, or even in the middle of the year or the next semester you're going to be allowed to continue and have the privilege of teaching 20 hours or 25 hours a week and so on. So it becomes a very, very dangerous thing, I think, for the future of universities. And I personally am very, very concerned about it, because I've seen about how many universities in America have moved in this direction, and they do not get any benefits, no health benefits, no payment into the pension, nothing. So they are cheap laborers. And I think it is one of the more dangerous developments that has been occurring in higher education.
Precisely. That's the problem that we have to...
There's not a consolation for you, Manuel.
No.
Is, in other words, we are seeing this more and more in a way that is quite brutal, actually. And so there's developed a whole class of people, and when an economy is shrinking or not expanding, then these people are obliged to remain. At least they have something called a job, you see, so they cannot go searching elsewhere. Or think of changing careers and borrow money to go and study law, some of the younger ones, and so on. You see, so it is a very worrisome development, and has been accelerating.
Now, the situation that we have in Chile is that this same kind of reasoning has been applied to several sectors in the country, the economy. And the results have reached a point where a sort of counter movement or counter offensive, let's say, it's starting to build up. Because as we have gotten to such extremes in this kind of developments, now we understand that is a point that is inconvenient for the country as a whole. And so there's a whole movement in the opposite direction, precisely to rebuild. For example, all the students that were in the streets, as I told you, their basic idea was to rebuild the public university system. And this is also going on in other aspects of the economy and society.
Yes.
Now,
can I ask you a question, Manuel?
Yes.
Have you had the development, which I've noticed in many, many countries now, a development of a series of private universities that are popping up?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
In the last 20 years, we have now about 60 universities, and that is about 10 times the kind of the number of universities that we had before. And of course, all the research, all the publications, all the full-time academics that remain, they are all in the 6 universities that were so before this process. So now we have those 6 that struggle to keep their productivity, to keep their academics. Meanwhile, we have all this huge number, 9 times as much, of other universities that do very well, because they all
have some of them managed to attain a high level of quality?
Not one of them. Not one of them. They are
so
all.
They're money-making machines.
They are money-making machines on the basis of giving classes, with a very unstable kind of professors, with taxi professors, and with no research and with no kind of other activities. For example, let's say public concert teams, symphony orchestras. They do not have those kind of things. The public universities do. Now, but they are struggling. And so, for example, you can see the venerable building of the law faculty of the University of Chile where most of the presidents of Chile have studied and where most of the research in law takes place and the publications come out from there. But of course, you see the windows, the glasses are broken. Meanwhile, just by the side, you have a huge building. It's a sort of airport building, but it's not. It's a private university. And they do very well because they only do classes and they do not have these full-time professors and etc.
Right. And they, of course, charging tuition. So,
well, both charge
of course,
more or less the same tuition, but
of course. Yes.
And the tuitions have reached a level that are absolutely unsustainable. For example, the mean income of a family of the richest part of the working population, let's say, has to pay 1 month of its income to pay the tuition of one child in the mean profession.
Right.
If they go to medicine, they have to stop eating and doing anything for 3 months.
I understand.
And that's the richest 5%.
So there's no system really of scholarships, financial aid, working. The university allows a few hours of work a week, loans.
Now, as a response to the mobilizations of last year, the government has approved a system of cheap loans, let's say. They charge about 2% a year, and with a cap in the payback. For example, a professional has a limit to what it pays back to the loan, and that is 10% of its salary. So it's a sort of a tax on the salaries of professionals.
Yes, of course. I mean, that has its dangers, of course. You see that in the United States, the total debt of students is bigger than the total owed on credit cards.
Yes, I know.
So imagine what has been happening over the last 20 years.
Of course.
Just loans.
Of course.
And then, which are impossible to pay back.
Yeah.
It's part of the crisis, of course. It's something like $1.7 trillion or something. We're talking really big sums, loans that were easy to get, just like the subprime mortgage, exactly the same. Just give them.
Of course.
And now the students, of course, cannot pay them back because they cannot even find jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another crisis that this has given rise to.
Yes. That's more or less the situation that
it is.
That we have. As I told you, happily in here at least, we seem to have reached the point where it was too much of a bad thing. So now there's a movement on the other direction.
To the other side. Is there a movement to counter this, what we have been talking about, this undressing of the state and dismantling it in Chile?
There is a movement in the universities. It's huge because all the academics, all the authorities, and all the students are part of it. And,
but in the society in general.
In the society in general, there is a movement to. There is a movement to get back on the most serious consequences of the let's say neoliberal model. For example, the inequality of income. The inequality of income is a huge theme of debate in the political arena today. And
Yes.
everybody are in agreement that the inequality of income has reached the point that has to be returned. But on one point, that is the structure of the civil service, there's not yet an explicit movement to rebuild it. The ideas of new public management have permeated all the academic profession, the specialists, I mean, in this kind of idea.
Yes.
And that's why we think that your writings are so important, because you make a very profound analysis about why the democratic states need a professional bureaucracy, and the government should not replace it but lead it. And the idea that this is a special kind of relationship, that it's has a high quality in itself for public institutions, and etc.
And I would go further. It's not just that. It is also that societies cannot exist, democratic societies, really and flourish without some sense of common values and objectives. And what NPM does is basically to destroy that and say, really, society is made of individuals.
NPM, you mean
individuals are the
new public
entrepreneurs.
management?
Yeah. And the collectivity is not important. And that I find as a social consequence to be a very, very nefarious consequence. Because in the end, all the society will be losers. You see? And I think there is a struggle with this in the country where it all started, which is here in the United States. But there is a struggle with it. Unfortunately, we have one party that has gone very, very much to the right. And there has to be some more balance brought into that party. The only way that's going to come would be if Obama is reelected, because then the Republican Party will have to say to itself, will have to rethink all of this, and will have to say to itself, look what's happened when we became so extreme. That's the one hope, to be honest with you, in the immediate future. But the debate is definitely there, except now that we are caught, there is the justification that we are caught in an economic crisis, where economic growth is very weak and not significant and so on. So, in a way, when they say cut the deficit, what they mean is cut this program, cut that program, and so on. But that's the thing. So it's again, they benefit both when the economy is booming, we don't need to pay taxes, to also when there is a very difficult economic situation and say, well, you see, we can't spend money on this, we can't spend money on old people, we can't spend help young people, you see. So because really it isn't to do with the economy, it's to do with an ideology that has developed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. Now, in a certain sense, it seems that the growth of this ideology has a lot to do with the hypertrophy of certain economic sectors, the bankers, for example,
Yes.
or the guys, the oil men and the miners, and
Yes.
because they all sort of profit from these ideas that, from another point of view, seem quite mad. For example, the state has always been important for business, for example, for markets. But if you sort of have an anarchist ideas, some guys will profit, perhaps, but society as a whole will not. And,
I mean, I can kind of understand a bit why this philosophy would go very far in America, because it's always had historically this
Yes,
fascination with individualism and so on.
of course.
It's much harder for me to understand how social democratic countries can also embrace a good part of that. You see that's but except even here, even though we had that, we did have another side. Except for at least 3 decades now, we have been moving in that direction, and I think it has gotten out of hand. But maybe sometimes you have to go so far that it becomes, the absurdity of it begins to show the disadvantages of this philosophy, so that it forces you then, the kind of pendulum
Yes,
begins
that's our
to
case.
swing back.
That's precisely our case.
Yes, this exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like a movement that has to run its course.
Yeah,
And when it runs its course,
yeah.
then
It gets
it
gets back.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's more or less
I'm too optimistic, but I think that it's clearly has been, because it's been several decades now.
yeah, at least 3. In our case, 4.
At least 3, not 4, almost. Yeah.
And but for making this return wave, a counter wave, to make it powerful, you need ideas, and you need sound ideas, and you need deep studies, and you need a good reasoning, because people react like that. We need ideas to react.
Right. I fully agree with that. You can't keep giving the same arguments that you were giving 45 years, 50 years ago. You do have to actually recognize changes that are taking place in the society, changes that are taking place on the global level, and adjust those ideas. Yes, absolutely. And then find other reasons of what the state can actually do now and what it should do, which is not the same thing as after the devastation of the Second World War, where the state, without the state, nothing would have happened.
Sure.
So the state had to take complete charge of the reconstruction of the economy, then after that, the modernization of the economy, and so on and so forth. And I mean, so
for
I
example,
think
in our case,
and you're right, we need to think more and develop new ideas rather than merely, applying old formulas that we used to use and were very good and very applicable, but for that moment.
For example, in our case, and in all developing countries, the state played a huge role in the economy directly, because there were nobody else in place.
That's what I mean. There was nobody else. No.
Exactly.
It's the same thing in Europe after the Second World War. There was nobody else.
Exactly.
There was no capital.
Of course. And it is not the case now. But on the other hand, in another aspects, the state has to increase its role. And of course, it needs a bigger bureaucracy. And if you compare the Chilean bureaucracy, for example, with the German bureaucracy, the German bureaucracy is much larger. And if you compare the Chilean bureaucracy with the bureaucracy in Haiti, the small island, the Chilean state is much bigger. And if you compare the present Chilean state and its power with the state that we had 100 years ago, the present one is much bigger. So there is a correlation between development and the size of the state and the size of the bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
Because
but sometimes, because as we started at the beginning of the conversation, I said that, of course, it's always a target, the bureaucracy, in just about every country. Even if you think about, most citizens in the European Union think that the bureaucracy in Brussels is the size of the Soviet bureaucracy, and in fact, it's very small.
It's very small, sure.
You see? And
by the way,
it's running their lives. They think it's running all their lives in gigantic bureaucracy. It's living off their money, but in fact, it's very, very small. I mean,
1% of GDP
to spend the money. You see that is voted because there are not enough people
of course.
Random.
By the way, I enjoyed your last book, the one I received. Thank you very much. And and it's fantastic because it analyzes this very particular phenomenon that also, if you want to build a larger market, you need to build a supranational state. And of course, that's what has been taking place in Europe. And now the crisis has put that into focus because they won't be able to solve it if they do not enhance.
No. And in fact, if you look in the last few months, they have taken many measures which are federal measures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the central bank has a key role in saving the Eurozone. Sure.
Absolutely.
Sure. Well,
I would have loved to be there with you.
Oh, yes.
But as I said, we will do it another time.
And I think that your ideas are very, very, very useful, really, if I may say so, to give a solid foundation to this counterwave that now is rising in our country, and that I hope it will succeed in getting a more balanced
conscience. But as you know, for some people, these are retrograde and bad ideas.
Oh, sure. That's
for
what
some
I say.
People, of course. Yeah.
No, but that's a huge mistake, and you argue it very soundly, very well. And thank you very much for your work, and thank you for your time.
Well. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in flesh.
We will find a way to bring you here.
We will definitely do it.
Okay,
it was a pleasure talking to you. And don't hesitate to edit it.
Okay, I give you an embrace on the distance, but we hope to do that personally.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will check and we will send you the file.
We will talk about it. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Manuel.
Bye-bye. And please say hello to Lisa.
I will. Thank you very much. You're so kind.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.